Alright, so third time is the charm. Alright, so here it is. We've finally done it. Oh, let me get some music playing. Just something a lot more low key this time. That's a little bit too much. Here we go. Okay, so we finally done it. Okay. Okay. Looks like that wasn't going exactly as I was hoping it would. But it should be better now. Okay. Just a little bit of glitches with my recording software, actually. It was just hogging up some sort of resources. But so for our first development, we're going to be doing farming all throughout here is the plan, with the city sort of coalescing right there around the river. So I'm going to start with this main avenue that will cut through this area with sidewalks and street lamps, and then additionally we'll have this little intersection here, and I expect to put housing and obviously all of the improvements as well into segments, much like would have been historically done. So we'll basically think about this in terms of sort of neighborhoods. Warstock. I can live with that as a name, even though it seems we're probably going to want to change that at some point. It's a little bit too close to Warsaw for comfort, or Bialystok. That's probably the idea. It's just a combination of the two. But adding just a few little roads here and there to sort of paint out an idea of how I want all of that to look. Alright. Let me make sure that I'm pulling it from the right connection. Alright. Now, I'm trying not to remove too many of the trees, because obviously it would be more useful to actually chop down some trees with them. Get some logs made, you know, rather than just turn them into empty lots. Unlike the city government of Jacksonville, Florida, we, you know, are incredibly efficient in our republic, and we won't stand for wasteful nonsense. Okay, so now I'm going to put some gravel roads out here, and let's set up the agro farm. So we go here, and you're gonna want to go to industry, and we're going to specifically want to go to food industry. Food and crops related, agro farm, as opposed to the livestock farm. which at some point down the road, I haven't used that yet, actually, but obviously that was one of the main exports for the Soviet Union, and I don't know how important it was for, say, Poland or Yugoslavia, but I imagine that it's a tidy sum. Okay, looks like that's how close we'll be able to get that big field there. Alright, and on that side I'm going to delete the road. And I'm gonna start laying out the fields a little bit first, so I can get a sense of what is going to end up being the most space efficient way of plotting these out, because they do not like being on hills. This might be an easier section to just use medium fields on. Yeah, that would appear to be the case. And then gonna give some space for a road in between that and the next. Alright. Now, when it comes to these farms, the farms are, if I remember correctly, actually free to construct. It is the agro farm that costs anything. So it's best to just set up one agro farm and a whole bunch of these early on. Because essentially they're not extra cost. And because this, unlike something, you know, historically based, like, I mean, you know, pre-modern based specifically, like, what's it called? Banished, or even Dwarf Fortress. It doesn't have a seasons system, so, you know, all of the fields can take however long they need to start and continue growing without there being any loss in production due to, you know, well, loss. Now, this might be tricky. It would appear as if this land is simply just not level at all. In fact, if we show the wireframe, and doesn't look like there's much we can do about that one section. Shite. What I guess we can do, however, is build that, and maybe, yeah, if we do that, a little bit there, connect that. What we can do is maybe just a small wooden bridge, or maybe not wooden. That's too much. 30 miles per... Okay, that'll be fine. In something like Simutrans, that would also, you know, have all sorts of weight restrictions, so I'm a little bit hesitant to just use whatever is the cheapest available, bridge, just because, you know, you don't know exactly how they're going to account for that in the simulation. Alright, but there we've got some gravel roads, got all of that connected, and finally let's just get that one. Now, like I said, it's best to just keep putting them down, but yeah, right now we've got a whole bunch of big farms and just a large amount of farms in general. So to make sure that production is consistent, I'm going to add a few small and medium fields, because those are going to rotate quickly, and I can fit them just about anywhere. So those will be helpful at maintaining our production for like domestic food as opposed to export, because with export you obviously want larger farms. Oops. Oh well. Actually, yeah, let me just cancel that section. It's gonna look really out of place and not make sense and be a waste. I'll use that with gravel. Now, with the way that the game works is that you spend a little bit for whenever you're constructing, if you start leveling and things, but in reality, it's like all of the actual construction costs of new buildings gets debited as the construction starts. So you can stop the payments by pausing construction, or by doing part of it yourself and part of it through, you know. Okay, so let me. Okay, so this is one thing that's a little bit worrying. Oh, it works perfect. All right, so we've got some grain storage there. Let me add just a few more little farms, or here, we'll go with medium here. Now the interesting thing about this album, it's obviously, in case you couldn't guess, a Soviet rendition of Bossa Nova, specifically early Bossa Nova, like classic era, Tom Jobim and such. And this in particular is a Tom Jobim song. But Bossa Nova was the music of the Brazilian military, shit, why did I do that wrong? Dictatorship. It was sort of known for being kind of meaningless and light and always, you know, relationship savvy and kind of trivial stuff. Very bourgeois. But it's also smooth and very Latin, and obviously came from a very troubled colonial country. So the Soviet rendition is actually quite interesting. I mean, they play it well. All right. So what we're gonna do with the agro farm is that we're going to actually, once it's constructed, instead of using workers to, and I'm pausing it now so I can actually put up some places for people to move in, but normally you would have to use workers to farm all of these fields, but instead you can also use automation. You can use machinery. So that's going to be our model. So instead we will be using people at another facility where we'll have a warehouse and a food factory. And so we'll start producing food that we can actually then ship into our town. Let's see here. Let's see which. That building's alright. This one does seem better. But it's a lot of people. It's not a lot of difference in cost, however. 2,000 for another 70. workers. Yeah, it's definitely a lot more efficient. I'm going to turn that off. We're not going to automatically get citizens for this. We're just going to construct these first. I'm going to give them a little bit of space so that we can work with the footpaths. And let me see exactly how many people work in the food factory, for instance. Maximum number of workers, 170. And the way that workers actually work is that you need to have 3 times this number available, just because there are going to be multiple shifts working at any one point in time. And I'm trying to think, how are we going to handle this with the warehouse? So if the warehouse is like this, it's got the rail connection there. How can we sort of future-proof that if I'm ever going to add rail? I suppose we could do it like that. You know, a sharp rail turn is bad, but it's it's survivable. And I'll sort of flatten that out to, again, kind of future-proof that area. You know, obviously, at some point, we're going to want to come in and properly handle that. But we build that, and the other thing we're going to want is obviously this food factory. And we'll build it, yeah, like that. And then we're going to put in a proper asphalt road here. Suddenly an asphalt road came out of nowhere and connected out like that. So that way, you know, the bus will drive in, drop people off there, and we can still get our connections. But now, you know, the warehouse, the trucks are going to have an easier time picking up deliveries from there, and I can actually have an idea where I'm going to run a train out for that. And at some point I'm going to have to sort of, in fact, I might want to just quickly build that, or envision what that'll look like now. Okay. Oh. Yeah, that won't be hard at all then. It'll be fairly simple for me to build some sort of junction there then. And I'll be able to get trains, you know, through. Okay, so I'll keep doing that, and now we want to go back to residential. One more of these. And then on top of that, let's just put in, you know, 1 or 2 little things to spruce up our little prefab area. Ironically enough. And so now we're definitely going to have enough people. In fact, one of those, the last 2 I'm probably not going to fill entirely. And we can put in a grocery store, which I'll probably want to do here. I'm trying to think. It does seem kind of far in this block to be putting it here, as opposed to in this block. And if I put it here, for example, I do have the option to build a warehouse here at some point if I don't think I'll ever do that though. Let me just think about this. Okay, so, you know what we'll do? We will put in the grocery store over... Shit. I'll subdivide this little block. It's massive. I didn't really think about that. But, we've already fallen to imperialism. We're starting to build subdivisions. Oh God, help us. Sorry. Oh, Lemon, help us. I'm really not making a case for myself. I sound like one of those, like, semi-ironic guys. But I'm just not. It's just, this game, you know, sort of encourages that in some sense. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm live streaming. I'm really tired. At work. Alright. But no, Lenin would not have had any problem with subdivisions. There's nothing more inherently, oh shit, I'm gonna have to change that, inherently imperialist about subdivisions. Instead, the critical issue is with urban development that building these suburbs are actually incredibly damaging, primarily because they're only even possible within the imperial core, really, and they're built entirely off of the fear of colonizers being overrun by the colonized. You know, they're inherently racist in a lot of senses. They're filled with the terror of, you know, some sort of colored horde taking over the inner cities. And in America, obviously, there's just a fuck ton of examples of that, you know, being outright stated at one point, and now it's just implied. And even though, you know, you might say, oh, but it's so trendy now to live in the city center. First of all, that's only because of, you know, a huge amount of gentrification, which has essentially stripped the urban core of, you know, from colonized peoples, people of color generally, and it's taken from these populations their ability to live in these city centers where there are supposedly these new opportunities and, you know, for wealth, which is really to say new opportunities for labor that does not is not being changed into labor within colonized countries, that has not been outsourced, or, as people are being told, labor that will be automated. First of all, automation is not actually for nearly any of the amount of jobs that people are being told they need to worry about automation. Automation is not going to come and suddenly take away writing jobs, unless you're writing imperialist propaganda, in which case, tragically for you, that is incredibly simple to automate, apparently, and bots are doing a much better job than you. So, and any of the ones who have been pretty effective at writing propaganda for imperialists lately have been basically just writing as if they were a bot, so not sure how much that means. God. I'm sorry. For anyone watching this in the future, please forgive me if I sound like I don't know what I'm talking about, or I'm just a reactionary or an idiot. I'm not. I'm, again, very tired. Long day. And if you're watching this from the future, just a few days before we had the whole Meghan McCain crying about someone questioning APAC, and by someone I mean Ilhan Omar. And, well, no, Ilhan Omar is not a comrade, she's just a Democrat. It was still just absolutely hilarious watching Meghan McCain just break down sobbing, and claiming that she felt attacked, acting as if she was some sort of like honorary Israeli. It was baffling, but I mean baffling not because I didn't understand in a literal sense why it was happening, you know. Settler colonial states obviously have to stick up for one another because, you know, who else is going to stick up for something so disgustingly based in genocide and apartheid? But it was still just really baffling to see someone actually, you know, and that's what's been happening a lot lately, people who don't just think this or say things that, you know, approach those ideas, but instead just outright make all sorts of very bizarre claims, you know, or statements that directly, you know, reflect that kind of ideology at its most ludicrous. But frankly, it feels like this particular moment, late stage capitalism, truly is, you know, if it may not be actually special, but culturally, it genuinely feels like you're living in the butt of a joke. You know, it's like anytime you say or think something sarcastic, you know, something that you didn't think anyone could say, they say it, you know. Like, people were making jokes about J.K. Rowling and the ridiculous thing she was saying after Harry Potter, and I swear to God, the first time I saw a post saying that she was talking about how Dumbledore and what's his name? Johnny Depp, sorry, Grindelwald, were having a very intense sexual relationship. I thought, holy shit, they've really gone too far with this this joke. I mean, isn't it kind of dead already? Like, she's already pretty ridiculous. And then I find out, no, she this was a real statement. But basically, when it comes down to it, suburbs reflect essentially the racist half of settler colonialist ideology, because the actual settlers in settler colonialism, you know, they especially if you're talking about the early days of, for example, the U.S., you know, they are moving to these areas because, you know, they want to, in a sense, escape, and they'll say religious persecution, which technically you can make a claim about the Puritans, But regardless, more so, it's about they, were hoping to escape, and this is more generally true, the realities of, this early post-feudal, mercantilistic European environment where all of the former peasants of Europe were being pushed off the land, enclosed off the commons, and forced into these cities. So this, bizarre myth, this American dream, relates directly back to the idea of returning to this feudal state, to live on the land, to farm for yourself, where you can actually, create your own sustenance. However, there's two levels of deceit there. First of all, under feudalism, as you well know, you didn't really just live for yourself. You were part of this community, and most importantly, you were paying rent as taxes to your lord, your feudal lord. And more importantly, not only were you doing that, but you were also, you were not going to be able to find that once you actually got to America. You instead were going to be so encumbered by the debt of simply traveling there that you would be forced, essentially, to live, as an indentured servant. You were literally forced to live within another cramped, disgusting city, and to work for someone else in order to be able to survive. And they were able to do that with the earliest stages of European settlement, but later, the debt became less indentured servants, and it sort of changed its nature. But in reality, the idea didn't particularly change later on. Even if people were no longer being legally chained into some sort of indentured servitude, they were still economically, sort of forced by the fact that, it was no longer a feudal society. In order to attain the same basic level of sustenance, you now had to be a member of capitalist society, and most importantly, due to the way that land was speculated upon, especially in early America, which again was also a huge component of early American settler colonialism. That land was coming at a steep cost. The farmers hoped that, much like conservatives in California claim to hope that an increase in market rate development will lead to lower housing prices in California. They hoped that by constantly expanding land into the American core, that they would achieve somehow, just a much more affordable price for land. And I guess to some degree, eventually, they were. After, of course, a very long period where speculators on land were able to carve out the pretty pennies first. And in fact, for the speculators, there was never obviously an interest to compete to make the land more affordable. They simply wanted a larger amount of it for themselves to speculate upon. And both forces, they were able to raise the prices on land to the point where it was essentially not survivable for new farmers to pay for it, which made the farmers incredibly upset. But at the same time, they were able to propagandize to the farmers that if they simply had access to more land, there was a supply problem, essentially, and that's where the cost issue was coming about. And so the farmers were infuriated, and they demanded expansion into new lands as a result. And in fact, one of the main complaints in the Declaration of Independence is that Britain, for a lot of legal reasons, had decided not to expand as much of its actual sale of property into the American core, into the Ohio Territory. And this is so, like, they just then propagandize within the Declaration of Independence. They refer to this with all sorts of racism against Native Americans, but most clearly they try to say that this is about security just as much as it is about being able to afford the land, which is, there was never a security issue had they not been expanding there illegally to begin with, very much in the spirit of Israel's illegal settlements as well. Another connection between settler colonial states. But obviously, so America is upset about this land and this need for land in order to achieve this mythical American dream, this settler colonial dream of freedom from the societal pressures that were created by capitalism in the first place, is obviously weaponized as a tool to achieve the true colonialist aims of replacing, displacing, and expanding markets. And so, millions of Native Americans are slaughtered, and how were they able to convince people to really do it? Obviously, they propagandized the hell of it. Obviously, they created and instilled racism to, act as a superstructure, but the base, obviously, is that land is necessary for land speculators, and therefore it is also necessary to the myth. But this whole land issue and cities continues through the Industrial Revolution, and so with the invention of trains, the whole purpose of passenger trains as a private entity in America is that they are able to purchase the land around their stations that was previously worthless and sell it off as small towns. They're able to plat it out and dramatically increase the value of this land that was, again, also still stolen through genocide. But the passenger trains are able to expand these cities, but there's still not too many suburbs at this point. There are some small industrial towns opening up as industry moves from the interior of cities, which are becoming too costly for them, to these new developments that can be reached by train. But it's truly actually the invention of the streetcar that begins the story of American suburbs. Because with streetcars, cities are able to grow in a totally new way. You can build streetcar lines out, and they will still be touching the city, so it's not creating entirely new towns, but these new suburbs that were previously so far out that they had to develop their own economy can instead become merely expansions of the residential aspects of the downtown that is now becoming unaffordable for the residents as commercial and other interests outprice them within the city proper. So I just bought some tractors, I bought some harvesters and some covered trucks, a few different types, but let me just make sure that I have connected to each and every one of these fields. I don't want to leave any of them out. But these streetcar suburbs, and here in Jacksonville, Florida, we have plenty of them. Here in Jacksonville, Florida, we actually have some of the few examples of non-white streetcar suburbs, but they basically allow the idea of suburbanization to begin. But the positives about them is that they are both historical because they were usually created around the 1920s or older, but especially they are relatively dense while still lacking the amount of density that inner cities do have, which can become unappealing at times. So they're still, of interest to families in the way that city centers no longer are for many people, but they are dense enough to still have the positive implications for city planning. They are still walkable, by necessity. People had to walk from each one of these streetcar stations to their home, to their, to the businesses along the route, etc. However, these streetcar suburbs required streetcar companies that would also be speculating on land to actually build the streetcars and streetcar lines along with them, which was obviously a huge expense. So, once the bus was developed, along with it came the idea, after a whole bunch of legal wrangling and jaywalking being invented, the idea, of course, of government-built roads taking that role. So buses can now transport people, and as cars and buses started to eat up a little bit of the streetcar's business share, the companies that actually built buses and the actual Firestone company that made the rubber for tires had to think, and GM and Firestone and a few others actually decided that it would be best if they killed streetcars entirely. So they made a company called National City Lines, I believe. I forget the name. Anyway, and they would purchase all of these streetcar companies around the country. They would perform hostile takeovers as much as possible, do everything to lower their business share beforehand, and then they would destroy each and every streetcar that they could get and replace them with buses. And to make sure that there was no going back, they would actually destroy the streetcars permanently, which is why there are so few streetcar systems in America. And in fact, it's only in some of the poorest, most underserved, and most neglected historical black communities in Jacksonville that these streetcar neighborhoods have actually survived with intact streetcar tracks, because it was simply neglected entirely that they should be torn out. But anyway, so streetcars get killed, and now instead suburbs are going to be built around cars. And it's actually after World War II, with the introduction of the National Highway System, which was basically just a land grab plan that they were able to get away with this. And so the federal government would take the role that rail companies previously had done of building the transportation out to these cheap lands, and instead the land developer only had to rely on massive tax incentives and government programs that allowed people to, quote unquote, buy homes, which really meant rent them from mortgage companies, but whatever, to buy homes in these suburban subdivisions. And obviously these were meant for whites only, and even after segregation, segregation ended on white terms, on capitalist terms as well, if you can even say segregation ended. And so the segregation, the legal end of segregation in the South and across the country meant that the wealthiest inhabitants of historical black communities fled, just like whites had fled from those inner city centers, because while they were historical black communities, they were treated terribly. A lot of these, for example, Sugar Hill in Jacksonville, a historical black community, was a very wealthy neighborhood and housed in mansions right next to our Central Park all some of the first African American millionaires, for better or for worse. I don't know if being a millionaire is positive in any sense, but whatever. But they would house these first millionaires. But at the same time, the city saw fit to not connect any sewer lines to almost any of these historical black neighborhoods. And so instead, these communities had no sewers, and they, like in Sugar Hill, they had constructed a large garbage incinerator in the center of the neighborhood. On top of that, cities would make choices such as destroying historical black utilities, services, or improvements in the neighborhood. So, for example, again in Sugar Hill, there was a medical research university there, which was dismantled. It was one of the first historical black medical universities. And so, once segregation ended, there was no reason in these wealthier inhabitants' eyes for them to stay behind in a community that had always been doomed. And so instead, they went where the funding had always gone. They went where they knew that they could actually get certain resources. And they still faced a lot of challenges once they moved. However, one might say far fewer challenges in many ways. And so all of these historical black communities were left behind, and with them the poor black inhabitants were also very much so left behind. Now their property values were completely gone, and there was no taxes or other benefits to their neighborhoods, and there was no money or people with money or job opportunities within those communities, and so they were left essentially to bleed dry, and that's more or less what they did. And as a result, these suburbs, which usually consist of pretty poorly constructed buildings, really. You know, they're not exactly the highlights of architecture. These post-war suburbs are very cheaply built and were intended always to be sold for credit, to be sold for a short amount of time, and to be sold at a massively inflated cost, and this problem has only increased as time has gone on. And they are made very much with the automobile not only in mind, but enforced, and they strip the ability for these communities to develop beyond the automobile. You know, there's usually no sidewalks, despite these neighborhoods being ostensibly entirely constructed for residences. There are usually there's no walkability. There is very large amounts of space between houses and between houses and the road, and these roads are usually connected onto major thoroughfares rather than onto a grid, so people are forced to walk down these long, winding suburban roads, which you might see in, you know, satellite shots, and they're really counterproductive for actual walkability or transit uses. So you're forced essentially to drive, and considering the incredible cost of owning a car, and in fact in the US, car ownership has to be massively subsidized by constant amounts of credit, large amounts of you know, loans of all sorts, and all of that is utilized. In order to make anyone capable of owning a car, even if they are required to do so under extreme amounts of debt. And these cars, of course, oh shoot, I forgot to turn off cars from the future, shit. But that of course means that in order to own a car, you must do so under an extreme amount of debt, and you have no choice in it. So cars are essentially a way of, by constructing these car-based suburbs, they're able to essentially enforce, you know, the elimination of further opportunities for the poor, for the working poor who can't afford a car, especially minorities. And it's most disturbing when they do this and then require a driver's license to be the mandatory form of ID, especially for voting. So these cars are basically able to separate people who can afford to move through that way and people who cannot. And these transit systems are therefore so heavily underutilized by, you know, many communities, and are so ineffective due to their design that their ridership continues to lower, which means that their income goes down, which means that their ability to run an effective transit system is dramatically cut back, which obviously results in incredibly poor service, which just feeds back on itself. And this is actually more or less a crisis for modern cities. There's a whole class of people, people who just, for whatever reason, can't drive, can't afford a car, and they are left completely helpless to, oh shoot, I think I should be doing that. They're left completely helpless to, let me see, which one is it? This one. Find new opportunities. You know, a lot of times when you try to apply for a job here in the United States, one of the first things they try to focus on is whether or not you have access to reliable transportation. And what they mean is, do you have a car or someone you can carpool with? Because your transportation system is so unreliable due to its lack of consistency in service, its lack of funding, its lack of resources. You know, do you have access to anything but these transportation systems that do not work? And even if you have a bicycle, you know, especially here in Florida, that means you cannot run work in any sort of job that requires you to have a good presentation, because you will be sweaty. It is incredibly hot. It will make you ragged, and because the roads are so offensive to pedestrians, many times drivers will kill, you know, bike riders. They drive like maniacs here. And you know, there's plenty of cases where people have been forced to use a bicycle as their main means of transportation in the city, and they've just been killed by reckless car drivers. And really, car driving is incredibly inefficient as a mode of transportation, and all of this hubbub you might be hearing about, like, oh, well, it affords freedom. That's just fucking paid ads by fucking Ford in order to get people to believe that this is the world they want. People throughout almost all of humanity have been able to get freedom by walking, by fucking riding a bike, or by riding, you know, even a horse. You can't ride a horse if you're gonna have cars on the road. But there's just a million other options if this elitist, pretentious, nonsense goal of, you know, freedom, America, is really, you know, the issue at stake, which obviously it's not. It's about, first of all, automobile profitability, and in the very end of that, it's also really about on top of automobile profitability, it's also really about the racist and class-based separation of these workers, saying that you do not belong in our new society. We will make it impossible for you to be a contributing member, which we will then punish you for, right? And that's how that works, right? That's the goal in mind. And so these suburbs are really, you know, an example of that, painted really disastrously all over America. And they're disastrous as well for the environment, especially here in Florida. You can see it. They've totally destroyed the ecosystem. They lead to a huge amount of damage to the environment. They lead to a ridiculous amount of pollution. The new land construction is always clearing out an undue amount of forest and wetlands, which contain a huge amount of CO2. They also create a huge amount of problems with flooding, because these wetlands are naturally protective against flooding, and we've been destroying them. And they also create problems with the aquifer, which is why there are so many sinkholes that help destroy all of these new buildings. And on top of that, I mean, they're really built in very unscrupulous ways. A lot of these new townhomes and constructions are designed very, very poorly. and very dangerously. God, I've been going on for a while, I guess. But let's see here. I think the music stopped, and I should have taken that as a cue because it was 40 minutes long. But here, let me put this on. But really, my goal with this development is going to be obviously to show, you know, some of the how to properly play this game. You know, I've seen a lot of really painful things where people don't understand how electricity works. You have high voltage wire that runs out of your, it's shipped in from the other borders, and it is also what you get from your power plants. And switches divide the lines into two. They have power measured in both voltage and wattage, and you put them into high voltage into transformers, and you get medium voltage as a result. You run those medium voltage wires into transformers. And just to further demonstrate, because I've seen this and it hurts me every time I see it, but you see that arrow whenever you're placing something with an electrical connection? If that arrow is small, it's medium. If it's large, it means high voltage. And that direction of the arrow, that is the direction the wire actually has to go in. Alright? I've seen people build a substation and they'll try to build a wired connection through, you know, that road connection area. That is in the wrong direction and it will not work. You know, this is not city skylines. These wires are a little bit more serious. But the good thing is that as a result, you kind of have to plan. Oh shit, I didn't notice that. You have to plan your development more or less around how you're going to get these wires around. So speaking of that, I did not think of that. That was an example of bad planning on my part. Now, bad planning will not be permitted here. Yeah, this is totally unacceptable, and whichever planners were responsible for this, they're gonna get censured. And next time I'm making my 5-year plan, they're getting a little love note from me in the form of "fuck off, you're not included in my planning team." But there we go. Now we should have power to the factory, and as a result, now we should be getting workers coming in. There we go. Yeah, those buses were basically empty because people would show up at the factory, and the factory people would say, "Why the fuck are you doing? What are you doing here? We can't help you." But it looks like. Alright, so we're gonna need a hospital as well. But, now, I do have fires on, so I am also going to build a, railroad station. Not railroad, sorry, firehouse. God. It shows where my mind is, huh? Alright, I'll build that there. Build that there. hopefully that should have... Yeah, I mean that should... Yes, it does. It does have electricity. Good. I've been working with a lot of different town layouts, and this is the first time actually that I've tried this, and it does seem to be working out a lot better. I can easily envision how I can expand this well without losing a whole bunch of connections, but let me get 3 ambulances just so that I can really sort of deal with illnesses from across the town more easily. And I'm also going to build another little prefab here, so I can hopefully... I want a small one. I just want something... Oh, that's way big. I want something small enough I can fit in here, because I want to get some doctors, not doctors, sorry, some teachers for the school across the street. Looks like I'm not going to get so lucky. Aha! Why do I speak so soon? Now, I've turned off the ability to have people get automatically invited, because I think that's dumb. But it's especially helpful because I'm going to invite quite a few experts from the Soviet Union, and then, yeah, because I need them in order to have teachers, because otherwise, like with staff, they help run the school, but it's teachers that actually change how many students are going to be in the classroom versus in the schoolyard, which obviously changes whether or not they're getting properly educated or not. But hopefully, yeah, now there's a good amount of teachers there, so hopefully that also means, oh, cool, I can know all these facts about them. Lifespan 83. Wow, I know beforehand how long they'll live. That's terrifying. Past days, unsatisfied demands. Oh, booze. I need to build a pub. That's an important thing to notice and construct. I'm also going to need to build a cinema because, I mean, these people are people of culture. You know, they watch Father's Day, alright? They are people of culture. No, I'm kidding. They probably like Courier, even though it hasn't come out yet in this timeline. Courier is actually my favorite movie. I watched it when I was in the middle of this incredibly abusive relationship, and it's sort of like this very bleak Soviet version of The Graduate. It was made in 1986, so it's at the peak of it's made at the peak of the war in Afghanistan, so that's like a constant theme. It creates a lot of tension, and then on top of that, it's like there's also this aspect of, like, you know, the impending end of the Soviet Union, which is always on all of these characters' minds. You know, they sort of mention it with without knowing that it's going to happen. And then on top of that, the kids' parents just got divorced, like at the very beginning of the movie, and he just got told that he was going to get drafted for the war, and then he has his own relationship at the same time, so it's all sort of interwoven. And instead of The Graduate, which as a coming-of-age story is really about someone who realizes he should be happy and not being, this is about a kid who realizes he shouldn't be happy but wants to be, and is eventually forced to grow up and accept that he can't. It's beautiful, actually. It's also free on YouTube. It's an incredible film. I highly recommend it to all of you. Go watch it. You have no excuse not to. It's a wonderful film. Let me buy some fucking wheat so that they can actually make some food. That's the other issue. You have to have wheat for them. And tragically, with my farms, they haven't started producing yet. So that's not going to be producing anything for a while. And if I go over here, see, the problem with these teachers, well, I guess I've got enough right now, but generally a problem with these teachers is that they're getting poached to be doctors instead. So they want a church, they're not getting that. Well, now you've got a pub or tavern. Yeah, it's within walking distance of literally everything. Good, 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 good. There is a school. Yeah, there is not a way for them yet to go to the cinema. And I believe that's the only thing right now that allows them to fulfill culture. Now if I go over here, I'm going to build some footpaths. And footpaths are really critical to getting this game right. You know, to doing well at all, you have to really manage space and consider the efficiency of routes and just what it's, you know, actually like to be a pedestrian, which I think is fascinating. Out of all the things in this game, that's definitely up there for just the most interesting thing to provoke a thought about. You know, how do you truly consider space as a city builder, you know, city builder game in a way that is not constrained by the private car, that doesn't even consider them really. You know, these buildings don't even need the road connection. It's far more important to have these footpaths, which I think that's really cool. Because right now we're at a point, and obviously transportation is not one of the largest contributors to global warming, but you know, personal cars don't use that much gasoline really. Instead, I think it's far more important to notice that the way that affects everything else about our built environment, the way that affects the way we consider space, the way that we consider efficiency in movement, the way that we plan out all of our developments. And that's important because all of those things are incredibly important to how we manage this planet, and especially when it comes to our land use, you know, that's where we are seeing, you know, through sprawl and misappropriate use of land, which is caused by a market system. That's where we're seeing the inability for a market system to create a sustainable environment. You know, not only are we producing too much greenhouse gases, but we are inefficiently destroying our filtration system to get rid of those greenhouse gases, in large part because we are not using the land efficiently, because we are planning it with cars in mind, with huge, massive parking lots taking out what once were forests. Speaking of that, we're about to contribute to some deforestation right now ourselves. So let's get started on that. Can't deal with this music right now. It's just so much. I have been getting a glitch, by the way, if the developer ever sees this, where like sometimes you'll be constructing something and like just a red lamppost or something will show up, and green is another thing you see. And I understand that it's got to do with how you deal with, you know, the objects that you're showing whenever you're showing the validation of placement of a building, which is understandable. But if you do see that, just check that out, and hopefully it's not too much of too damning of a problem. But we do need to get some people working there. So I don't know how many people are working here right now. 70? Well, let me divide 2. Actually, how many people work here? 30? 60? Yeah, I'll sell that one. But yeah, we'll have to unfortunately deforest this area, and eventually we'll inefficiently develop that, and probably, I think, here I'll put some sort of, like I might put the technical university or something around here. I think that's my plan. And that way we'll basically start our whole city by working on farming and eventually exporting food. We'll build a road connection as well. Or maybe we'll do rail out there eventually. We'll probably instead use the rail. Oh. Oh. Well, that solves that. I didn't realize I was all the way in the corner of the map. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. And then eventually I'll have to branch out over onto this side, build another city, and they'll eventually be joined. Yeah. population statistics. Average lifespan is going up. Good. Education. Yeah, it's going up. We don't have any universities, so that's a problem. But yeah, no, the average lifespan really is climbing. That's very good. And we've barely got anyone unemployed. And then we also just build a few pieces of party insignia. Now I'm not sure where exactly this is supposed to be, if I'm actually building Soviet insignia, but not part of the USSR. Of bushes here. Some acacia trees. And we'll put a few poplars here. And these will grow, and I believe the poplars get massively big, so I'll just use beech here. Shit. Oh, whoops. Alright. So as you can see here, we've got a lot of wood. In fact, we're going to need to store this wood. Looks like I'm gonna be kinda screwed. Unless... Darn. Okay, what about that? Surely. Yes. Thank God. There we go. Better. Now I can put that there. And somewhere else, I'll put a warehouse for it. Not a warehouse, sawmill. But, yeah, looks like... There's no reason not to put it, like, here, I think. I can't imagine this pollutes that much. Famous last words. Maybe I'll put it over. I'll decide next episode exactly where to put the sawmill, but for now, hopefully, wood will, start being put here, and then we'll just start shipping off those logs, or chopping them into boards for export. In fact, let's see, what's the difference in value? Wood is 10. Boards are 13. Oh, it's not worth it. Yeah, I'll just be shipping them as is. Unless... Oh, no, it's measured in tons. So yeah, definitely. I'll just connect a quick road there. Sorry, Forest, but let's just connect that up, and yeah, that'll be good. At some point I might need to put a gas station there, but we're not even running any trucks out that way, so yeah, it feels like a good situation right there. A lot of people are chopping the wood. A lot of people are farming. Let me turn off that ugly ass wire frame. And the farms, let's see. It's currently at 65%, so yeah, hopefully they'll be done pretty soon, and we should see between all of these a huge harvest all at once. Nothing that can't handle though. And then, yeah, as we've already been doing, we'll be still shipping crops over here. It'll take a can actually produce a lot of food. And while we're at it, last thing I'm doing before I call it a night is we are going to set up a covered hull truck to take food from the warehouse and bring it to the grocery store. $33 unemployed workers. Well, there's plenty of jobs available there. It's just you're gonna need to be transported there. So I'm going to guess. Yeah, only 4 people working there. It's like 12 there, so who knows exactly what that deal is. The job situation in this game is not unlike the economy in Victoria 2. They're both better and worse. Intricate, highly detailed, kind of crazy, kind of totally made up. All right, just checking in. Now, I hope this is wheat. It looks like wheat, but you never know. There might be a dirty Khrushchevite somewhere behind in those bushels, trying to force us to convert to corn, dirty American corn. Now, don't get me wrong, corn is incredibly nutritious to a fault, and it's a native American food, a very good foodstuff at that, and the opposition to it was incredibly racist. However, at this point, American corn was subsidized out the wazoo so that it could outcompete with Russian grain as an export on the world market, much like it also helped essentially subsidize American beef against Russian beef, which has a lot of bad implications in general. But, you know, it creates a lot of problems in general once American food, this corn that we can't actually produce economically, has to be subsidized to holy hell so that it can outcompete the local food consumed by people in NAFTA countries that were forced, more or less, to consume American corn or to die because American corn companies outproduced not only the local local subsistence corn farmers, but it also they were therefore able to drive those farmers out of business, and so a lot of cash crops were also able to come in and pick them up as cheap labor as a result. Really truly devastated a lot of economies, but not really the story of our fair town of Warstock. So what the fuck is that music? Okay, well, good evening and good night. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you around next time. Alright, peace out.